You can't just keep your boot on these people's neck forever because you're worried about what might happen, even if it's a legitimate worry about what might happen if you take your boot off. And the idea that on the other side of this, the Palestinians are just supposed to accept you live in subjugation in perpetuity, forever, because some of your leaders made bad decisions.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Really glad you're here for this one because this might be one of the most charged conversations I've put on this channel in a long time. Coleman Hughes and Dave Smith sit down to go head-to-head on one of the most debated topics of our generation, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the occupation, and whether there is any moral justification for how things have unfolded over the past several decades. Coleman comes in defending a position a lot of people hold, and Dave comes in swinging with arguments that genuinely stop me in my tracks. These two are not yelling over each other, they are actually engaging, and somehow that makes it hit even harder. Stick with this one all the way through because the moment near the end is the one that had me rewinding multiple times. You will know it when you get there. Also, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you are watching from right now. I love seeing where this community stretches across the globe, so say hello down below. All right, let's get into it.
With you. I don't think there's anything dishonest, though, about leaving that out. The point is that we're talking about the disengagement in 2005, and you have the senior advisor for the prime minister overseeing it telling you that what that was about was putting the peace process in formaldehyde, making it impossible for the Palestinian state to ever be achieved, that was their goal. Now, you could say they came up with that as a second best option. Okay, fine. But the point is that so many of the Israel defenders, they describe it as if, in fact, Douglas Murray, when we debated, said that was the Palestinian state. That was a two-state solution. And this is just like, that's what's intensely dishonest, is to leave this out. Now, about the settlements, I think I'm pretty sure, I'd have to go back and double check this, but I think the number of settlements in the West Bank drastically increased in the following couple of years after 2005. Again, this
okay, but
really...
what I said was that the Gaza disengagement also, there was like 4 West Bank settlements that were added, that were also evacuated at the same time. It's not important. What I want to address myself...
They built up a lot more settlements, though, over the years. On net, there were more settlements in the West Bank, and there's many more settlements in the West Bank than there were back then.
So, the point I'm making is not just it was Plan A and Plan B. It's actually deeper than that. The reason they switched to Plan B is because they came to the belief, based on Arafat's behavior, that Arafat actually did not want the political process to lead to a true peace, right? So if you believe that the peace process would essentially be a gift box with peace on the label, and then the moment you open it up, you get terrorism, if you come to that belief based on the behavior of your negotiating partner, that they intend to take whatever they can get out of the negotiations and then launch terror, then thwarting the peace process is not thwarting a peaceful situation like America and Canada. You're not thwarting a true two-state solution. You believe, based on the behavior of your negotiating partner, that you're thwarting what would essentially be a situation where terrorists take over parts of the West Bank. Oh, this is the other part of the interview that is crucial to this point, is that Sharon came to believe that a Palestinian state would be too weak to control its violent minority, i.e. the Fatah would not be strong enough, would not have the state capacity to prevent Hamas, to prevent it from coming basically another Lebanon, a Lebanon where half the country is controlled by a terrorist group, right? And then you're as a leader of Israel, you're basically telling people, well, if we really come to believe in good faith that this guy is not a partner for peace, and we've got to wait till we get a real partner for peace, giving him 2 states will essentially mean that we're going to be in a situation where terrorists control strategic high ground, a place from which they can much more easily launch rockets and missiles and smuggle anything over the border with Jordan, which would be very easy to do. And you're essentially telling your people, I'm going to put you in much more jeopardy than you're already in. So this is the trade-off Israel faces.
Yeah, it's like, which I know I've quoted before when talking about this, but it's that old Thomas Jefferson quote about slavery, where he's like, we have the wolf by the ear and can neither afford to hold on to it nor safely let it go. And, like, it's like, I just, Coleman, they've been occupying them since 1967. Are they concerned about what might happen if they take their boot off their neck? Okay. But they still don't get to do that to people.
What strikes me every time I go back to this segment is how rarely these conversations start with the most foundational question. Not who is right, not who fired first, but simply who was actually working toward a negotiated resolution and who had reasons to prevent one. Dave raises a point here that gets far less attention than it deserves. He cites a senior advisor involved in the Gaza disengagement, someone with direct first-hand knowledge of the decision-making, who described the explicit goal in his own words as putting the peace process in formaldehyde, not pausing it, not recalibrating it, permanently suspending the possibility of a Palestinian state as a deliberate strategic outcome. Coleman's counter-argument is that the shift in approach was driven by Arafat's conduct at the negotiating table, that the Palestinian leadership at the time didn't actually want a workable agreement, which left the other side with no viable path forward. And to be fair to that argument, failed negotiations are a documented historical reality. Bad faith at the table does happen, but here is the structural problem with that reasoning. The moment you establish that the other side's unreliability is your justification for abandoning a process, you have created a permanent exit, because you can always locate something the other side did, some statement, some action, some failure, and point to it and say, this is why we cannot proceed. That logic doesn't have an expiration date. It just gets refreshed with new examples every few years. Dave's Jefferson reference is worth sitting with. The original quote describes the dilemma of holding a wolf by the ear. You can neither hold on safely nor let go safely. Dave uses it to make a different point. That feeling trapped in a difficult situation is a genuine human experience, but it does not automatically confer the right to trap someone else indefinitely in response. Those are two separate moral questions. Combining them, or treating one as a sufficient answer to the other, is where the argument breaks down.
We got a real problem with black crime in this country, Coleman. But if I said, let's reinstitute slavery and that will take care of the problem with black crime, I think you'd go, yeah, you don't have a right to do that. And if not having slavery means that it's a little bit more dangerous in some areas, tough, deal with that. You don't, Israel, look, dude, this is just so obvious. It's bananas to me that anybody who lives in a first world country on this side of the Enlightenment can just not say, look, Israel's got two options here. Your options, if you want to be a moral country or whatever, your options are you can say, we can't give them their own state, and so we're just annexing all of this land and giving citizenship to all the Palestinians, and we will all live under one state together, or you can stop occupying them militarily and let them have their own, autonomy. Those are the options. You can't just keep your boot on these people's neck forever because you're worried about what might happen, even if it's a legitimate worry about what might happen if you take your boot off. And the idea that on the other side of this, the Palestinians are just supposed to accept you live in subjugation in perpetuity, forever, because some of your leaders made bad decisions. And then, you can say like, look, you could have made this argument about Egypt. I don't think they had a strong enough state to control their radicals or something like that. Now, we could get into a whole separate argument, which is that I think there's a very strong argument that actually Israel is going to face much more of a terrorist threat while they're occupying these areas than they would if they were to give them their own state. And I think there's lots of good reasons to suspect that. But just purely on a principled ground, this is just totally indefensible. And there's no other country that we would call a democracy who behaves this way. It's like, I don't know. I just find this whole thing to be so goofy. Like, either this is Israel, either you're saying Israel has a legitimate claim to Gaza and the West Bank, or you're saying they do not. And if they do not, then they have to stop occupying them. And if they do, then they have to give citizenship to the people that they control. So it's really fundamental Western civilization stuff.
So the analogy to slavery is a bad one for many reasons. But first, yes, Jefferson and Southerners in general, they feared, partly based on Haiti and other examples, that if they gave slaves freedom, it would result in a race war. And this was highly motivating for Southerners. It turned out to be completely wrong. Now, there was a lot of evidence at the time that this wouldn't happen, namely the fact that you had Black people living very peacefully all over the North with no problem. You even had free Blacks in the South with no problem. And so you would have had to cherry pick massively to look at the Nat Turner revolt, say, erase all the other evidence of peaceful coexistence between whites and blacks and say, we can't let these people have freedom because look at Nat Turner. Not only that, there was no, anytime there was Black leadership, the most famous Black leader, the most important Black leader in the aftermath of the Civil War was Booker T. Washington, right? You can make the same argument about like the Civil Rights Movement, right? We can't give them voting rights because then they're going to make decisions that are going to be terrible. It's going to be a race war. They're going to destroy us. They're going to, slaughter us. Every single popular Black leader, Booker T. Washington, utterly peaceful, had the total faith and devotion of the Black community. He was the most beloved figure, and he was fundamentally nonviolent. Martin Luther King, absolutely the most beloved figure within the Black community, much more so than Malcolm X at the time. And even Malcolm X in his most radical mood, never...
He wasn't a terrorist, yeah.
He wasn't a terrorist. So there was an enormous amount of evidence in the case of African Americans in the United States that the likely result of loosening the chains was not going to be a race war. It's just that people ignored that evidence.
But
let's translate that to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They leave Gaza.
This is the section I keep coming back to because the logic Dave puts forward here is genuinely difficult to argue around structurally. His claim is that in any modern democratic framework, there are only two positions that are coherent and internally consistent when it comes to governing a population. You either formally incorporate that territory with full legal citizenship and equal rights for every person living there, or you end the governing control and allow those people to determine their own political future. Those are the two options that hold up under scrutiny. What does not hold up, he argues, is a third arrangement, indefinite control with no resolution and no defined endpoint, while simultaneously maintaining that the governing system qualifies as a democracy. That combination doesn't work logically. And the binary he lays out is worth examining on its own terms. If the territory is yours, the people in it are yours. They get the full legal protections of citizenship. If the territory is not yours, then you don't have standing to veto whether those people get a state. The two claims cannot coexist. Coleman doesn't directly engage with this framework. He challenges the analogy Dave is using, which is a fair critique. No analogy maps perfectly, but the underlying binary itself goes unaddressed. The second point about individual accountability is where I think the human dimension of this debate lands hardest. Dave's argument is essentially this. You are telling an entire civilian population to accept their current conditions because of choices their political leadership made. But those individuals did not make those choices, and many of them were born into the situation and have lived their entire lives within it. The response they receive is that their leaders' decisions are their burden to carry indefinitely. That is not a policy argument. It is a statement about whose suffering is considered worth resolving and whose is not.
They leave Gaza. Two different countries impose a harsh blockade in response to rockets against Israel. And one of those two countries gets October 7th and not the other. So one question I have for you is like, why doesn't Hamas attack Egypt? Why can't they spare a single rocket for Egypt if it's all about the blockade and occupation?
No, I mean, obviously, because their hatred of Israel is on a whole different level. And also, like, yeah, I don't know, like, there's
So then it's not all about the blockade and the...
It's not. No, it's not all. A lot of it's about the creation of the state of Israel. A lot of it's about the fact that they view that as their land, that a lot of them did get kicked out of. Of course, all of this stuff is involved. But anyway, back to your point, though. But, like, so say there was a higher risk. And again, I wasn't saying, I wasn't saying, a lot of times when people make logical analogies, people say, well, that's a bad analogy because the situations aren't the same. But there's a difference between equating two different things and making a logical analogy. The claim isn't that they're the same. But let's say there was going to be a real increase in crime, or let's say there was that some of the Black leaders were more radical and were, hold on, let me just finish.
Sure.
And were advocating violence. Is the answer then continue the institution of slavery? I mean, the thing is no, right? It's obviously, and look, the thing about this is with all of this stuff, with all of this, I just feel like to be a defender of Israel requires you to not be like fair-minded to both groups here. It requires you to think of like, oh, but think about the danger that the Israelis might have to deal with if they were to give these people a state. It's like, yeah, think about the danger that the Palestinians are in being militarily occupied. Like, how are you going to sit here and tell these people that you guys have to embrace nonviolence, your leaders all have to be nonviolent leaders, while the Israeli leaders can be as horrifically violent as they want to?
Coleman's question about Egypt is one of the stronger points he raises in this stretch, and I think it deserves a straight answer rather than being dismissed. Egypt also enforces border restrictions. Egypt also does not freely permit movement. If the objection is purely about a blockade as a mechanism, why does Israel draw a categorically different response than Egypt does? Dave's answer is that he isn't making an argument about blockades in the abstract. He is describing why this specific conflict carries the historical and emotional weight that it does, which goes back to the founding of the state, the displacement of families across generations, and the specific experience of being told that land you lived on no longer belongs to you. That context is not a justification for violence. It is an explanation of what is actually driving the intensity of the reaction. There is an important difference between those two things, and conflating them shuts down more honest conversation than it opens up. The most significant moment in this final segment, and I think it is easy to move past it, is when Dave makes the double standard argument. He is describing a situation where two populations are being evaluated by completely different criteria within the same debate. One side is expected to produce consistent, nonviolent, politically moderate leadership, and any deviation from that, any radical voice, any act of resistance, becomes evidence that the entire population cannot be trusted with self-determination. The other side, when its decisions produce significant civilian harm, and has those decisions analyzed through the language of security trade-offs, strategic necessity, and difficult circumstances. The question Dave is raising is not about which side is sympathetic. It is about whether the analytical framework itself is being applied consistently. If it isn't, if the standards shift depending on which group you are evaluating, then the conclusions that framework produces are not reliable. The argument doesn't just weaken. The foundation it is built on becomes visible. Historically, this pattern, the argument that a population cannot be trusted with freedom because of what freedom might produce, has appeared at multiple points across the modern era. Colonial administrations used it to justify prolonged control over territories they described as not ready for self-governance. Governments resisting civil rights reforms used it to warn of instability and disorder. In retrospect, those arguments have not held up. The populations they were applied to turned out to be entirely capable of governing themselves. That is worth keeping in mind when we hear the same structure of reasoning applied today. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I will see you in the next one.